It doesn't seem like in 2020 public education is in a particularly good place. Whether you're, a family who is wondering when or if your kids will even be able to go back to school, whether it will be safe if they do that, or if you're just worried about the federal government's approach to public education over the past few years, you probably have more than a few concerns, which is why I am very glad to welcome to the show the author of Schoolhouse Burning, Public Education and the Assault on American Democracy, author and professor at the University of South Carolina Law School, Derek Black. Welcome to the Damage Report.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Glad to talk about this. This is an important topic. So tell me a little bit about, I know that we're gonna go into some of the history too, but how would you rate the current status of public education and the government's approach to it?
Well, I mean, it's really a tale of two different worlds. I mean, we have a lot of, relatively well-financed school districts and communities out there that, they can care for their kids at home, or they've got, new buildings and lots of space outside so that they can accommodate, sort of in person. And then we have these other group of kids who don't have good access to internet, encountering a lot of problems, sort of economic and otherwise, and their schools are underfunded and have enormous skyrocketing costs to buy PPE, retrofit the buildings. And so we really just have two entirely different situations. That's not really new at all. It's just that the pandemic has accentuated the problem.
Well, I know that there has been discussion about what the obligation of the federal government should be to provide additional funding, both for the context of 2020, but specifically, for instance, for things like PPE. So far, how would you rate the level of resources that have been committed by the federal government to make reopening the schools and all of that as easy and safe as possible, especially for, as you point out, the school districts that don't necessarily have the property tax base that they'll have the resources they need if the government doesn't provide them?
I mean, it's been a pretty abysmal response. If you compare how much money Congress gave public schools during the Great Recession versus how much they just gave them for the pandemic, I mean, we're talking about a fraction of the dollars this time. And to be clear, during the Great Recession, it wasn't that costs were skyrocketing, it's just that local tax base was plummeting. Now what we have is local tax base plummeting and costs going up, and Congress only allocating, a quarter on the dollar compared to what it did last time. So, a lot of our school districts are in a really bad situation, having to think about lay off cleaning staff, lay off teachers. It is dismal in a lot of our communities, and I think a lot of those families are really worried about their children falling behind in a way that they'll never catch up.
So, in your look back at the status of public education, how I believe you describe it as an erosion over time of its place in America, was there a time where things were significantly better that we didn't see the sort of pattern that you're talking about right now? And how far back do we have to go to get to that time?
Well, as I always say, America started out with a great idea and it's been reaching to try to achieve it ever since its founding. So there is no sort of great old days in which our public schools were integrated and fully funded. I would never make that claim. But what we do have are good old days, so to speak, when leaders of both parties were committed to the idea of public education. And that's what has really changed in the last 5 to 10 years. That we have a 200-year plus history where we have our leaders and our country committed to the expansion of education because they say public education is the foundation of our democracy. Mm-hmm. It is the thing that we all need that will guarantee the preservation of all of our other rights. But now we're in a situation where we have a president calling them government schools in a pejorative sense, the Secretary of Education calling them a dead end, and the president and his platform saying that his goal is to provide private school choice to every single child in America. So we have one, and I'm not trying to make it political, this is just the facts. We have one party that for the first time in history is completely arrayed against the idea of public education. So we are in a new bad era that we have never seen before on that.
So the privatization that you're talking about there, the charter schools and all of that, it was pretty clear when Betsy DeVos was chosen that it's that she wasn't being brought in to, bring public education back to where it needs to be. And so I guess you've already sort of alluded to your views on her in that role. As a complete non-expert, she seems like a disaster for public education. But what do you think about Betsy DeVos in particular? What effect has she had in the years that she's been, in the US government?
I mean, she's been more effective than I thought she would. I've been involved in federal policy and testified as an expert before. And when she first took the job, I said, the fact that she's taking the job shows how little she knows. Because if she really understood the lack of power that this job currently has, she wouldn't want it. So I thought, well, she'll be a sideshow. Congress really reined in the Secretary of Education following the Duncan years because he had overreached. But she took the job, and what's amazed me is how much influence she has asserted, and it's partly because of how brazen she is. That she doesn't care what the law says. She doesn't care what American public wants or needs. I mean, I think even Congress got caught off guard. She's been in office for 3 years. Congress passed the Coronavirus Act, sending out, although not enough, sending out several hundred millions to our school, and we're thinking, you know what? She'll put privatization aside, at least for a little while, given that we're in a national pandemic. She'll let that agenda go. But as soon as the checks arrived at the Department of Education, she was already talking about how she could exploit the pandemic for her private school agenda. And she lost 3 or 4 cases in about as many weeks recently. And a Trump-appointed judge even said, in regard to her new policies trying to drive more money to private schools, the Trump-appointed judge said, the law cannot mean the opposite of what it says. Now, the idea that a federal judge would have to say that to a federal official is quite shocking. And so, she just caught us all off guard with her brazen attempts. I mean, for the younger listeners out there and folks that have got student loans, she was basically held in contempt of court because she insisted on continuing to try to collect student loan debt when the law said those students didn't owe it. I mean, that's outside of the K through 12 context, but the law, she thinks, obviously doesn't apply to her.
Yeah, it's just amazing. And so I agree, she's been very effective. Is she emblematic of a enduring change in the Republican Party's approach to education, do you think? Or hypothetically, if Trump were to lose and someday some other Republican were to run, is this like the new default position of the Republican Party, that charter schools privatization is the way to go? Or will we get back to 2 parties that might disagree on the level of resources that should go to public schools, but that they both sort of at least fundamentally agree that they serve a purpose and should exist?
Well, it's difficult to sort of predict the future for obvious reasons, but I think what we see is a party that has continually been captured by fringe ideas, not because Republican voters on the whole believe in those ideas, but because the big money donors believe in those ideas, and maybe a majority of the people who show up at a primary believe in those ideas. So, it's not news to say Donald Trump doesn't really represent the values of the Republican Party on a number of policies, but man, he sure is popular. And I think the same thing on the privatization and the vouchers, that the sort of libertarian wing, the sort of anti-tax wing of the party, the sort of Tea Party wing of the party, they believe that in the same way at the federal level, Social Security and healthcare are extractions of wealth from rich people. They say the same thing about public education at the local level, which is, I came from very humble beginnings, and that, hey, Derek Black basically extracted wealth from his neighbors so that he could get a public education. If you look at state and local resources, the overwhelming majority of them are spent on public education. So it is, public enemy number 1 for that wing of the Republican Party. And so I guess to answer your question, it depends on whether the party itself is going to be a big tent party and begin to reorganize itself around common values, or it's going to continue to be dominated by this sort of small fringe element. And right now, it's being dominated by a small fringe element.
Is there on the other side some sort of countervailing movement, either at the federal level or in individual states, to strike against this seemingly endless, movement towards more privatization, more funding to charter schools and things like that? Is there anything to balance that out?
Well, there has been in the last couple of years, and it's been very encouraging. So a lot of people would say, oh, Derek Black, he's frothing at the mouth liberal and tool of the unions or something like that. But when you look at 2018 and 2019, you saw tens of thousands of people in the streets marching on state capitals in red states. Not in New York, not in California. It started in the hills of West Virginia. a state that voted for Donald Trump at 70-75%. And then it moved to Oklahoma, a place with similar numbers. And then it moved to Arizona. 50,000 people marched on the Capitol of Arizona demanding for the full funding of public education, and 65% plus of voters voted against vouchers in Arizona, right? And here in South Carolina, we had the largest public protest on our state capitol grounds in decades. It was flowing over into the streets here. And so, I think what we see is that small fringe element has been gaining steam for a while, and we kind of ignored them, but they finally pushed so far that regular folks who don't want to politicize education, regular folks said, I have got to take to the streets. And so, that gives me a lot of hope, but we got to keep fighting because the people on the other side are just as determined and more well-financed, to be quite honest. So I think that, the public education advocates have got to fight.
Yeah, it's not hard to imagine why that push towards more federal money going to charter schools would receive a lot of financial support in that movement. But everyone should definitely take a look at the book Schoolhouse Burning, Public Education and the Assault on American Democracy. Derek Black, we really appreciate you joining us on the show today and lending your expertise.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.